Hello, everyone. Today we're looking at unemployment and vagrancy in the Elizabethan era with the objective of trying to figure out, was unemployment an actual problem in Elizabethan England, or were all the problems to do with religion? I've got two sources here to look at before we get underway. Here we have a wealthy man, and he's carrying a bag. Wonder what could be in that. And then here we have a very poor man. He's not carrying a bag, but we can see his hands are tied. And what we're trying to illustrate with these two sources is the differences between the wealthy and the poor, and some of the privileges of being wealthy and some of the consequences to being poor in the Elizabethan era. Now we can see that this wealthy man here on the left-hand side, because he has lots of money, he has some nice clothing, and he's quite well off. And we can see that this man here, who's quite poor, he's actually going to be punished. There's a gentleman behind him who's hitting him with a stick with some braided rope on the end. This was known as a cat o' nine tails, and there are 9 individual pieces of string with knots on them that would cause lashes and injuries on the back. But we can see where he's being brought to. He's being brought over here to the scaffold where he's going to be executed for being a vagrant. So we've got 3 key words to look at before we get underway. The first is a vagabond, and a vagabond is a homeless person who doesn't move around. They stay in one town or village for the duration of their life. This is very different from a vagrant, because a vagrant is a homeless person who wanders from place to place, and they'll beg in every individual town or village that they go to. The last is a rogue. A rogue is a criminal who's never caught, and today we would call them a fugitive. Now, the big difference we need to remember between a vagrant and a vagabond is the fact that a vagrant wanders from place to place. And these were quite common in the Elizabethan era because you typically wouldn't have a lot of opportunity to get money from different people in one village. If we were to go back in time 500 years in the Elizabethan era to High Wycombe, it only had a few thousand people. And High Wycombe today has over 50,000 people living in it. So villages were quite small, and if you wanted to be able to make money as a vagrant, you would need to move around from place to place. So increasing unemployment and vagrancy. So the need of work and the search for a job combined with rising prices means that people were often in a situation where they didn't have anything other to do than to travel around and beg for money. So this is something that we've looked at before, were the 9 main causes of poverty in Elizabethan England, and we'll go over it one more time just to refresh our memories. So rising inflation, this is when wages couldn't compete with the cost of food and rent and clothing. So meaning the job that you're working on, you're not earning enough money to buy the things that you need to live. Bad harvests in 1556 and 96 and 97, there were really bad harvests. This was due to drought, food production wasn't on par with how many people needed to purchase the food, and this causes food prices to rise. The less there is of something, the higher the price will be. So if you think of a Ford Focus, there's loads of these cars around. If you go to any Ford dealership, you can find loads of Ford Focuses on the lot. But there's very few Lamborghinis. Now, both a Lamborghini and a Ford, they both have an engine, they both have a body, they both have wheels. But the big difference between the two is there are very few Lamborghinis to buy, and this is why the price is much higher. So it's all about supply and demand. How much there is of something determines what its price will be, and the less there is, the higher the price. So in this case, bad harvest means less food means higher food prices. New farming methods. So farmers stopped growing food and they raised animals instead. It was kind of easier to do. You don't need as big of a field to raise animals as you do to grow crops. They would take land and they would enclose it, they would cut it down with fences, and this meant that there were fewer laborers needed. And if you used to work on a farm and you're no longer needed, well, you're going to wander into the nearest village or town and work. Rack renting, this was a sharp increase in rents. Especially in London, this was a big problem. So if you had a 1-room house to rent, you might say that you're going to rent it out for £1 a week. Now, there's 10 people who need a home, and they'll start competing in terms of the price. So one person might say, I'll offer you £2 a week, and another one might say £3 a week, and another might say, no, I'll do £4 a week. And this sharp increase in the rents meant that a lot of people couldn't actually afford anywhere to live, and those who did live somewhere were often kicked out. Rural depopulation, this has a lot to do with the new farming methods and bad harvests, so this one actually links to those. Unemployed farmers, they left the countryside, they moved into towns, and this caused a higher demand on the housing and food market. More people in the towns means there's more people and less goods, and we know the less there is of something, the more that it will cost. The dissolution of the monasteries, this was a rise in unemployment among the monks, servants, and laborers. They took away very vital roles in charity relief. In the Elizabethan era, there were no charities that were designed to help people. All charity work was done by the church. And if these people, like monks and servants, lost their jobs, well, they weren't going to be doing charity work any longer. Foreign wars and soldiers. War was quite common in the Elizabethan era, and war was generally fought over religion and land. And these wars would cause taxes to rise, and when taxes go up, the value of money falls. The second problem was after war, you had a lot of injured soldiers returning. If they had lost an arm or a leg or were blinded, they certainly couldn't return to farming because they were disabled. So this put a greater strain on the charity system that we can see from the dissolution of the monasteries was quite limited. Changes in the cloth industry. Cloth was no longer being exported, so weavers lost their jobs. And lastly, a rise in population. This caused a higher demand again on food prices, clothing, housing, all of these things went up. So we know the less there is of something, the more people are willing to pay. So feel free to just pause this video, just have a quick refresh of these because we will be coming back to them a little bit later in the lesson. Problems that led to vagrancy. One of the big issues was working on farms in the countryside. It was really difficult uh, to make sure that the crops were always going to yield the amount you needed each year. You were very dependent on rain, and we know that sometimes in the UK it rains a lot, and sometimes it doesn't rain for weeks on end. And to be a farmer without hose pipes and your own kind of water source, you were very much so relying on the rain to irrigate your crops. Living in towns, it was more convenient than living in a rural countryside. You were closer to everything. There were no public schools, so children would often just go to work with their parents and eventually take over their job. There weren't a lot of houses available, so people would compete by offering higher prices for homes. And again, this links to our keyword of rack renting. And people who lost their jobs often had nowhere to go, so they would just wander from place to place. If they didn't have a house in a village, they really didn't have a reason to stay in that village any longer, and they could wander around the country trying to get a job or trying to get some money. Now, vagrants, and these were the homeless people who traveled from place to place, they caused five significant problems wherever they went. Generally, when they went to a new village, there was an increase in crime, especially in theft and burglary. And that was simply because these vagrants didn't have anything themselves, so they would often steal when they would get to a new place. So the five issues that they would cause are as follows. They were seen as idle or too lazy to get a job. Now, there were two types of vagrants. You had impotent. Impotent means they genuinely could not work. They were missing an arm or a leg or they were blinded. And then you had able-bodied. And this meant that they could work, but they were just too lazy. They didn't want to. They were prepared to turn to crime as a way of life. They helped spread disease, such as the plague, by wandering from place to place. And this is something that we're really conscious of nowadays with the current lockdown restrictions that we're facing in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that if you travel around often, you can spread illnesses with you. There was an increased fear of rebellion. Many vagrants were actually ex-soldiers, so they knew how to use a weapon. And the rich people had to pay a poor tax, and this was a burden on the wealthy. So they got very angry and blamed all poor people for the fact that they were paying poor taxes. So here we have 7 different types of homeless people in the Elizabethan era. Vagabonds, remember, are people who remain in one place. Vagrants are people who travel around. And all of these different types could be a vagabond or a vagrant. They could stay in one place or they could travel around. The first is a hooker or an angler. During the daytime, they would take a wooden stick with a hook on the end. They would go and bang on people's doors and they would ask for money or ask for food. And sometimes they would come back at night and they would use their stick to reach inside of windows and steal valuables out of the home. Now we have to remember in the Elizabethan era, most homes were just one room and people didn't actually have glass windows. There would just be a hole in the wall to let light in. Now, the hooker or angler would use a stick with a hook on the end where they would often wet the stick over a long period of time and slowly bend it into a hook, and they would use this to kind of fish out things to steal. A clapper-dudgeon, this was someone who tied arsenic to their skin to make it bleed. Arsenic is a main ingredient in rat poison. It's very poisonous to people. They would rub it into their skin so they would bleed and then go a begging, hoping that people would be sympathetic and offer them more money. A doxy was a female beggar. She would carry a large bag on her back, and she would often knit at the same time. So the knitting would look like it was going in the bag, but in fact, it was actually a distraction. She would steal things while she was knitting from people who passed by, put them in her bag, and run off. So you could think of this similar to a pickpocket, somebody who kind of bumps into you when you're in a busy place, steals something off of you, and then runs away. An Abraham man, they just pretended to be crazy, hoping that their threatening behavior would result in people giving them some cash. A ruffler, these were a former soldier. They would often threaten people, they would beg for charity, they would rob people's houses. A dummerer is someone who pretended to be dumb, and being dumb means you can't speak. They would often just kind of mumble and shout nonsense at people. And the last was a counterfeit crank. They would dress up in kind of ratty tatty clothes. One of the counterfeit cranks' name was Nicholas Jennings. He would chew on a bar of soap to make his mouth all foamy. They would often pretend to suffer from falling sickness, which we now know today as epilepsy. So a little bit of a review. We've got the 5 main problems caused by vagrants. So reminder, a vagrant is a person who wanders from place to place and lives by begging. Now it's time for you to pause the video and see how many of the 5 main problems caused by vagrants you can remember. When you've remembered a few of those, you can hit play and double check your answers. Right, so we're back. So let's have a look at the 5 main problems caused by vagrants. So we know that they spread disease. They would cause a rise in crime rates. There was a fear of rebellion, especially because a lot of vagrants were ex-soldiers. The wealthy had to pay a poor tax, which didn't make the wealthy very happy. And they were viewed as often too lazy to work. So what did people do about vagrancy in the Elizabethan era? Initially, vagrants were punished to set an example for their behavior. Edward VI, he was really famous for burning a letter V into the palms of vagrants, and he would do that so when vagrants would hold their hands out together, palms up to accept money, people would see a burned V and say, oh, I'm not going to give you money because you're a vagrant. You're someone in society that we don't like. Local solutions, London used some of the hospitals there. This was following the dissolution of the monasteries when they took those back from the church. And they would use these as places to take care of poor people or even open an orphanage. In Norwich, Ipswich, Cambridge, Exeter, they experimented with introducing taxes on wealthy locals, and we know that that wasn't a popular solution. Some towns tried to tax the wealthy, but again, wealthy people just became resentful of this. So a central government was now needed to provide direction. And this would come in stages. This would be known as the Elizabethan Poor Laws. And this was the very first time in British history that the government decided they were going to do something about helping poor people and not leave it up to the church or leave it up to the wealthy. So I'm going to take a quick look at a primary source. This is an engraving from 1533 showing a vagrant being punished in the streets. So we have 2 questions to do with this source. We have explain why the vagrant is being punished in source C. So think of the problems caused by vagrants. And the second question, what were some of the main causes of poverty in Elizabethan England? And for question 2, you need to remember the idea web we looked at with the 9 main causes of poverty. So take a few minutes, pause the video, and have a think of what you would say to each of these questions, and we'll take it up in a few moments. Great, so we've had a chance to look at the source and to give a think about these two questions. So explain why a vagrant is being punished in source C. Think of the problems caused by vagrants. Well, a vagrant would be punished to deter them from committing crimes. We know that vagrants spread disease. We know that they brought about feelings of social unrest. We know that they caused problems in society. And we know that rich people didn't like taking care of them. Now, we also know that Edward used to burn a V into their palms to try to discourage people from giving money to vagrants and encouraging that kind of a behavior. Now, what were 5 of the main 9 causes of poverty in Elizabethan England? Again, you can have any of the following, but we need to know that there was rising inflation, bad harvests, new farming methods, rack renting, rural depopulation, the dissolution of the monasteries, foreign wars, changes in the cloth industry, and a growing population. That's it for today. Please make sure you go ahead on to show my homework and complete the quiz and any other tasks set by your teacher.